This is Dr. Charlotte Markey, and this is the last part of our class on gun violence as a public health issue. So this is a repeat slide that I showed you in class on Thursday, and we'll take off from here. So I believe I actually did show you this map also in class, so you can see how much gun use varies, or gun possession varies from country to country. So there's just a lot more in the United States than other countries, really anywhere else in the world. But really, in terms of health, what we care about is not if people own guns, but if people are hurt or killed with guns. And we see much higher rates of gun morbidity and mortality in the US. And so there are a number of possible explanations for this. And so one hypothesis that's been posed is just that Americans are more violent or more aggressive, that's just our nature, our personality. That's been pretty much disproven. We are not inherently a more violent people, but our crime is more lethal because we have access to guns, which make it relatively easy to kill someone. As you'll see here, there are more guns than people in the United States. These numbers look very, very different in other countries, in nearly every other country. So these are the sort of top countries in terms of gun ownership. We can then assume that if you were to look at most European countries, maybe the UK or Italy, that it would be even much lower, these numbers. We also know from cross-cultural research that mental illness can't account for more gun fatalities and injuries in the US. We are not a more mentally ill people, that we are pretty comparable to many other similar countries in terms of mental illness. Video games is sort of a easy answer, especially when children are involved, and we have data to suggest that video games are not really what's driving gun fatalities and injuries either. We do seem to have very different attitudes and philosophies when it comes to gun ownership. That the United States is only one of 3 countries in the world, the other 2 countries being Mexico and Guatemala, that seem to believe that people have a right to own guns, that seem to think that gun ownership is even something really worthy of consideration. We also know, though, that our country is a little bit more racially and socially diverse than a lot of other countries. This doesn't seem to account for gun fatalities and injuries, however. So that's a hypothesis that's been offered. It's a very sociological explanation, which may have some merits, but is not accounting for a significant portion of differences in gun morbidity and mortality in the US versus other countries. We do see that responses to gun violence really vary as well. In other countries, when there has been some sort of mass shooting, usually tougher gun legislation is imposed nearly immediately. So we've had a number of school-related shootings in particular that have brought about calls in the US for changes in gun legislation. But not a lot has actually changed, whereas in other countries like the UK and Australia and New Zealand, some legislation is enacted within weeks of these incidents. So what kinds of solutions may there be for reducing morbidity and mortality related to gun use? There are some ideas that are pretty uncontroversial in the US. That most people believe that safe gun storage is important, that people shouldn't just have guns lying around, that kids and teenagers and people who aren't trained to use guns can just easily access. So that's something most people agree on. Background checks is a relatively uncontroversial idea as well. You'll see in these data that Republicans, Democrats, Independents overall generally support background checks before people get guns. This is in place to some degree in some states already, of course, but it could be more thorough. It could be utilized a little bit more stringently. Gun licensing is also not all that controversial. It has not been enacted. It has not been brought up for real serious discussion recently, as far as I'm aware. But you can see that according to national polls, there's a fair amount of support for the idea that a license for a gun is reasonable. I don't fish, but as far as I understand, sometimes you have to get fishing licenses. I do drive, and I have to get a driver's license, and I have to get it renewed. So I think that licensing is something that is relatively commonsensical and may be considered moving forward, but again, has not been brought up for real serious conversation among politicians in recent years. There is some consensus for the idea that assault weapons should be banned. So assault weapons are defined in different ways, but for the most part, assault weapons refer to weapons that are basically able to kill a lot of people really fast. Arguably, if you're hunting or you're defending yourself or you have a gun for really most purposes that people claim to have a gun for, you don't need an assault weapon unless like you really think the zombie apocalypse is coming and that you're going to be, these zombies are going to be swarming your house any second. Sorry, that was meant to be sort of sarcastic and funny, but I think hopefully the point is clear that most people don't feel like they are going to be, taking part in like Die Hard number 6 anytime soon and need an assault weapon to help them. This gets much more controversial, much less support for the idea of buying back assault weapons. This has been done in other countries where people basically return assault weapons and they are offered some compensation typically for that, some sort of payment. And there's usually sort of a no questions asked policy involved just to get these sorts of weapons off the street. You'll see here, based on some relatively recent polling, that people in the US generally are not in favor of this. Stricter gun laws, just generally speaking, again, very mixed sort of support for this sort of general sort of philosophy, I guess, about guns. As you've seen through some of these figures I've been sharing with you, there are real political views in terms of what people think makes sense for gun possession and gun use. You can see here that there's a real split along partisan lines in terms of Republicans thinking that Republicans think that owning more guns makes everyone safer, and Democrats seem to think sort of the opposite. This is not just like a political or ideological question, though. Like, we can actually look at data to try to understand what seems likely to happen. And I think the cross-cultural comparisons in particular are pretty compelling in that when there are fewer guns available, it does seem like there are fewer injuries and fatalities due to gun violence. So this is just a cartoon that sort of illustrates this point, that some people think more guns would make people safer. again, the data seems to actually support the opposite. There was some recent gun legislation that was passed just in June of 2022. And it's sort of considered fairly light legislation, that no weapons were banned. The aim was gun safety and providing some funding for schools. This map here actually shows some of the data from a recent study indicating that higher rates of firearms are related to more homicides and suicides. So that's sort of an overview of issues when it comes to people in the U.S. owning guns and what the likely outcomes of gun ownership seem to be. There are instructions in Canvas for you for finishing up this module this week. Because we are not meeting in person, there are a few videos to watch. Most of them are short. There are just a couple of very short readings. There is our regular quiz. In order to get your attendance points, because I cannot see who has watched the videos which replace class, I'm actually going to ask you to do a very, very short quiz. That's an extra quiz just for your attendance points. And those questions are going to be based on really idiosyncratic, specific things from these videos. So if you've watched the videos, you should get those points without any problem. All right, I hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving break, and I will see you after Thanksgiving.